All right. There is a reason why most scholars haven't accepted his thesis of Mark, specifically notice Mark, being directly influenced from Homer. Scholars are more likely to see indirect, if anything, or really just Mark using common tropes and rhetoric of the day. First, MacDonald argues that it is very plausible that Mark would have received a classical education. According to MacDonald, he contends that Mark's gospel fulfills the criteria characteristic of literary mimesis as carried out by classically educated Greek writers of the era.
Okay, I want to interrupt there.
Mm-hmm.
He is right that most scholars don't accept this, so that's fair enough. But to be exposed to Homer doesn't mean you had an advanced education. You were exposed to Homer as soon as you went to school. We have exercises that indicate that the first sentence that people wrote was Homer is not a man, but a god. You learned how to craft your letters after the Homeric names. Jacques Bompère, the famous classicist, said, as soon as a boy entered school, he was engaged in mimesis with Homer. So the idea that you only in the ancient world were exposed to Homer in advanced stages is really ridiculous. And it really is ignorant, because we know that Homer was the primary way that people learned to write. Now, some people did it better, other people did not. But you didn't respond to my business about the Anchor Bible. Isn't that amazing?
Yes,
a bushel measure gets mentioned, and the greatest poet and author of classical antiquity does not.
I feel that there is this kind of apologetic in a way that seeps in, and even and I'm not trying to paint that all scholarships like this, but you got to imagine when you have what happened in World War II in Nazi Germany, and there seems to be a sympathetic response reacting to what happened to Jewish people, and we're trying to have ecumenical interfaith dialogue and trying to really make up for what the church has done in terms of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, absolutely.
There is this overreach, I think, of like everything's got to be so Jewish to the point where they're not Hellenized to the core, to the point where Yahweh Zeus, I mean, we're talking about they're literally fusing the deity of Zeus and Yahweh together. I mean, this is how far Hellenized Jews were at this time. To know whether the authors were Jews or Gentiles sympathizing with Jewish concepts or Jews sympathizing with Gentile concepts.
Well, and I know many Jewish scholars who say that appropriation of Judaism to understand the New Testament does no favors to Judaism, because they know that what you have in the New Testament is not a linear and tidy development of the fortunes of Israel. Mm-hmm. And in a way, the interest in, and I think you're exactly right, this overreaction to the embrace of Judaism because of the Holocaust is not doing a favor to Jews in their understanding. I've given lectures in synagogues, and people say, I am so grateful for your work because I no longer have to deal with my office mates who say that if I really understood their Bible, I become a follower of Jesus.
Right.
So it's a dangerous issue, actually.
Yeah, either way, right? Catch-22, because if you go full on that, this it has no Jewish to it at all, and it's just a jab at Jews and how they really screwed up, and that the true inheritors of Israel and the promises are these non-Jew Christians who follow the Christ, right? You have extremes on both ends, but it's interesting in that introduction, Anchor Bible introduction, the fact that they're not mentioning the Greek literature or even Virgil or any of that. What? Like, it's just that same, we got to look for Jewish antecedents only. And in fact, yesterday, we're going to be pulling up the Testament of Abraham and how important this is. And I don't want to give away your thunder yet, because you're going to highlight something that I think is powerful in the critiquing the critique. But it's Dell Allison Jr. who wrote the commentary on that I have on the Testament of Abraham. And I've spoken to him, and his training is only on the Jewish antecedents. They look only at Jewish stuff. He learned Greek in the 70s. He said, Dennis could be right, and I would never know, because I've never been trained or took the time to study it. And that's a fair answer, but it tells you the state of scholarship.
Yeah,
they're only they're looking with one eye open, like we named the course looking at the Greek with one eye open, they're only looking at the Jewish side with one eye, not looking at both sides together.
Of course, I'm blind in one eye, so I identify with that image.
Well, shout out to Imnag on the super sticker. Thank you for being here in the chat. I love you, man. Thank you so much for that support. Continuing, Dennis.
Yeah.
However, there is significant problem to his thesis. This is your thesis. MacDonald does not adequately address the counterclaim, which is that Mark's marginal socioeconomic status and his poor grammatical skills would have made a classical education unlikely. MacDonald dismisses this argument, citing David Rhodes and Donald Mitchie, who argue that Mark was a sophisticated literary composer. However, to be able to tell a good story is a far cry from employing the skills mastered through formal study of the classical texts of Greek antiquity. In fact, the style of Mark's Greek, which is not part of the analysis of Rhodes and Mitchie's narrative criticism, as well as Mark's social status, casts doubt on the assertion that Mark could have been the kind of sophisticated literary composer that MacDonald depicts.
Okay, very, very quickly. Mark's grammar is rustic and difficult to read because it is not elegant. And Matthew, but particularly Luke, improves on it. So I have no argument with that. The issue is whether an author would be exposed to the Homeric epics only in advanced rhetorical education. And that is not the case. And that's where later on we'll take a look at the Testament of Abraham and see an example of somebody who's just having a Jewish author who's having a lot of fun with Homer in order to make have fun with the Pentateuch.
So simply put, that we're going to cover this, but it's this author's writing in a rustic kind of way in Greek, not high sophisticated like Luke acts. And also, though, we have the socioeconomic, and we're going to dive into this more.
We'll get into the, go ahead.
Yeah, this is important. Okay. Here we go. To counter this, Dennis argues, one can no longer assume that Marcus was rusticus. He does concede, however, that even hoi polloi, how do you pronounce that?
Hoi polloi.
Hoi polloi, soaked up narrative poetry. In making this claim about hoi polloi, MacDonald argues that ancient Greeks were not exposed to Homer exclusively from texts.
That's true.
Notice the problem here. When arguing against theory of indirect influence, MacDonald rejects indirect influence in favor of direct. But when acknowledging the evidence against Mark having had access to classical education, MacDonald seems to be making an argument for indirect influence.
Okay, this is not a problem at all. I've never argued against indirect influence of Homer on education or on the culture. But sometimes an author actually is consulting a text to imitate. So he can't expect that his readers are going to know the epics by heart or to have read them recently. So having it available in the culture in a widespread way is what he's counting on. But for his own composition, he actually has a text, and we'll have some examples of it.
Okay, and just everybody who's super chatting, thank you for the support and your super chats. We will get to those when we're done critiquing here. Okay, MacDonald thinks that Mark was a Christian elite, but in first century. Christian elite was far different than a social elite. During this period, high Christian status did not necessarily translate into high social status vis-a-vis the larger Greco-Roman world. To demonstrate Mark's affinity with those of lower social status, note that Mark's gospel shows great sympathy toward those who occupied the social margins under the Roman imperial system. Both Jesus' teachings within Mark and Mark's narrations about the groups of people who followed Jesus describe people without adequate food to eat. The little ones, most likely including day laborers, peasant subsistence farmers, and fishermen, the sick and disabled, and slaves. Political and economic references in Mark's gospel, all from the social margins, also point to Mark's marginal socioeconomic status. Themes that reoccur in Mark include taxation, tenant farming and debt slavery, economic exploitation, and greed. These are not the concerns of social elites, but of those who identify with the social margins. Mark rejects even such basic status identifiers as kinship, and he rejects the status claims of those who like to walk around in their long robes and be greeted in the markets and to have the premier seats in the synagogues and at the banquets. Mark's affinity for the people of Galilee, a region known for its hostility towards the Roman occupation, his animosity toward the Jewish leaders and collaborators of Rome, and his distinct neglect for the well-established urban centers in the Galilee in favor of the villages, all point to a status of social marginalization and resistance to the accepted status markers of the Roman occupation.
Okay, two issues are so important. One is that concern for the poor is not a marker of one's own social identity. Take a look at Luke Acts. Luke Acts is written by a Christian and a cultural elite, and that author has more concern for the poor than any other author of the Gospels. So actually, you can see this with John Chrysostom. Peter Brown has done lots of work in Christian sermons and discourses where it's a part of the rhetoric of the morality of these texts. And to identify a concern for the poor with the author being himself poor is really a huge gap. Now, I don't want to get too far into the Q document, but in my view, Mark knows Q intimately. And if you remove the mythological layers that are in the Gospel of Mark, what you find is a document that is the place where you find most of the Galilean material, most of the concern for the poor, parables about slaves, and so on. So again, I'm not going to convince many people that you have Mark knowing Q and that material comes from there, but that's where I am. Now, if we believe that, what's his name? Mason.
Steve Mason?
Steve Mason, yeah. If we trust him, Galilee was not the center of resistance to Rome. It was in Judea that you had the problems. And so the idea that you'd have, a Jewish peasant in the north carrying on this way is really fatuous in my view. But the biggest problem is the notion that when you have a text that's concerned about the poor, that it's written by the poor. That simply is not the case. Even in the history of Marxism, you can see that it's intellectuals that had more concern about the poor than the poor themselves.
Interesting. So this is a non-argument technically. I mean, it's one could try to make a case, but there is no connecting those dots and making the case against what you're suggesting at this point.
It's a part of the rhetoric, and it can come from people who are marginal, right, but it doesn't need to come from people who are marginal. So there are other social identity indicators that help other than just a concern for the socially marginal.
Got it. So at this point, what it sounds like what's happening, Dennis, as we're getting into this deeper, is that, look, the grammar sucks. The guy's concerned about the poor so much. He's probably poor. How could you even think And you've already explained that it isn't even the social elites and their education that is talking about Homer.
That's right.
Even the non-social elite education was discussing Homer, teaching Homer. People had to immerse themselves with Homer. So at all levels of education, Homer is finding its way in it. So you already tackled that. You're already tackling the idea that this doesn't have to be a poor author who's, also identifying in those social economic margins. And then also you're saying you grant that it's kind of rustic. The grammar's not the best here.
Yeah.
Mark.
Yeah.
And maybe we can discuss a little more about why.
Yeah. But I would like to hear you answer this question. Mm-hmm. What would Robin Faith Walsh or Richard C. Miller say about the notion that the gospel authors are simply peasants and not Greco-Roman elites? Their work is so important in catching on, not just about who the authors were, but why New Testament scholars are insistent on making these kinds of judgments about the limitations of gospel authors. They were much more sophisticated than we are.
That's what both of them would say. And of course, you agree with that. And some would even argue that Mark's purposefully writing his grammar in this manner. I don't know what the answer to that is.
I don't think people do that. No,
I'm just saying there's some people who try to make this argument.
Of course, yeah.
But I would agree with you. This is coming from more educated people, and both of them would echo what you're saying there. It's really interesting. And you know what? Before we continue, Dennis, this is an interesting point to highlight something. Christians who may be watching this, do you want your authors to be dumber? Just so you can somehow, I don't know, is this winning an argument for you? Are you willing to say my saints and the authors of my literature were just dumb or not as smart? Or are you wanting to say these are smarter people? Christians were not dummies. I mean, you kind of have a pickle here, right? I'm going to think that you're actually giving more credit to Christians and Christianity with your argument here. These are smart
There's
people.
No doubt about it. Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So whose side do you want to be on? The ones who want to say these are dummies, or the ones that are saying, actually, these are really, really smart
Well, the
people?
opponents are going to say they're dummies who are inspired by the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit was smarter than all of us.
Of course. That's what I was getting at. But thanks, Dennis. Let's continue. All right. As David F. Watson notes of Mark's Jesus, in the marketplace of elite ambition, Jesus's claims would seem utter nonsense, given the concentration of themes, characters, and terms that ascribe honor to people of low status and reserve scorn for those in the upper classes. A strong scholarly consensus locates Mark not as an elite, but as a subaltern, and thus unlikely to have access to or even to have desired the classical education sought after by ancient Mediterranean elites.
Again, I say read Robin Faith Walsh and Richard Miller. That really is a very dated argument and does not take into account the literary sophistication of the Gospel of Mark, for example.
Okay. Then in 2011, Albert Hogerterb, forgive me for butchering that, performed a sociolinguistic analysis of Mark's Greek and reaffirmed the conclusions of Adolf Deisman that Mark's Greek represents a sociolinguistic product of the lower classes of bilingual Greek Aramaic speakers. Watson added that for Greek literary elites, the commonest offenses were barbarism and solecism, neither of which, adds Watson, is uncommon in Mark. Examples of Mark's solecistic or ungrammatical Greek include indiscriminate interchanging of verb number and tenses, run-on sentences connected by what H.B. Sweet, I'm going to just say, calls the simplest of Greek copulus, endless repetition of adverbs such as immediately, as well as clumsy, inelegant, and awkward transitions, narratives, and the use of literary conventions. What we have here isn't an author who is culturally elite or someone who is writing to that audience. Scholars are usually more open to Luke Acts being influenced by some Homer because Luke is seen as more of a literary elite. And
again, I would say the authors are assuming that Homer's place in society was similar to what Shakespeare is for us. You get exposed to say Shakespeare in college, perhaps a little bit in high school, but you really can't understand it well unless you get a graduate degree. In the Greek world, you exposed to Homer right away. It was what gave cultural definition. So I'm going to kind of summarize his arguments by having you put up on the screen, if you could,
Yes.
the part that talks about denial, the criteria of mimesis criticism, and my alternative logic. Can you find that?
Criteria. Yep, I do have it. Let me share my screen here. Bear with me. And we got some wonderful super chats, by the way, just to excite you, Dennis. There's some good stuff coming. So I hope that we have some continuous sophisticated conversation.
Okay, so I'm going to have you do some reading.
Oh, I'm with you.
Okay, so these categories come from Thomas Kuhn's famous book on the structure of scientific revolutions. And scientific revolutions happen because there are anomalous facts that challenge the paradigms of intellectual guilds. And there are lots of ways of trying to manipulate the science in order to make it to account for these alternative understandings. Darwin did it in terms of evolution, and Newton did it in terms of gravity, and so on. So the first thing one does with these unfortunate facts or these anomalies is to deny they exist. So if you'd read that, literary parallels.
Yep. Literary parallels between Greek poetry and the Gospels do not exist. Carl Olof Sandnes, for example, insist that the evangelists and their readers were insufficiently literate for strategic and hermeneutically freighted imitations to be meaningful. If one accepts Sandnes's dictum, it matters not how many parallels one draws between classical Greek poetry and the Gospels, how sequential they are, or how distinctive. Mimesis becomes moot, and its practitioners moot.
You don't even have to deal with the parallels. And that's true of the smart fool.
That's exactly
He doesn't give any examples or give an alternative explanation for the parallels. So you just say they don't exist. So if they don't exist, then scientific guilds suppress information about them. Continue. Since these
literary parallels do not exist, one may ignore and silence those who say they do. More than once, a publisher has refused to print positive reviews of my books. In one case, because my research was not sufficiently Jewish.
So we've talked about that before. Now, in some cases, scientists will recognize that you may have a one-time inconvenient fact or an anomaly to the going paradigms of the science. And in order to account for that, they use accommodation. So read that paragraph, would you?
Even if such parallels do exist, they are not mimetically intertextual, but dynamically intercultural. M. David Litwa, quote, "If imitation occurred, it did not occur in this bookish fashion. There were many more common ways for people in antiquity to absorb and adapt cultural lore," end quote. Traditional historical criticism, thus, will suffice.
Now, Litwa is very bright, very well learned, and I don't deny that you have a Homeric radiation in the culture at large. But one major way of transmitting the legacy of Homer and to alter it in terms of new identities is another. It can't be ignored. And so you have to at least acknowledge that a literary transmission is possible. Mm-hmm. So, and by the way, these three things happen in the margins the smart fool's criticisms.
Right.
He denies they're there. He wants to suppress them, and he thinks, well, these things are kind of in the air, but there's nothing important about it.
Right.
So then you have methodological assaults.
Even if such parallels were intertextually mimetic, no criteria can demonstrate it. Again, Litwa, quote, no amount of similarity between texts can prove a genetic connection.
Now, that
end
is
quote.
such a stupid comment by a very bright guy. Tell me a biblical scholar who doesn't see that the amount of similarities between the text points to a literary appropriation, or at least an indirect one, flagging a text. This leads simply to an interpretive nihilism. You
Right.
can't explain parallels, because even if you do have parallels, that you can't make a connection. So what about marginalization?
Even if one were to prove that some parallels with classical Greek poetry are mimetic, they are insignificant blips on the radar. This is a common conclusion in reviews of my work. Whew! The Matrix survives largely unscathed.
Yep, that's what I experience, and this discussion is an example of it. So here's my response to skeptics who follow this chain of argumentation. First, no models for literary culture were more popular in the Roman Empire than the Homeric epics. As Quintilian put it to his students, the proper place to begin our studies is with Homer. Like his own ocean, which he says is the source of every river and spring, Homer provides the model and the origin of every department of eloquence. At stake here is the satisfaction of my criterion 1 in Mimesis criticism, the accessibility of the model. So 2, I'll have you read this one. Mimesis stood
at the center of the literary education and production. Quote, the dominant notion in the literary aesthetic among Greek intellectuals in the early Roman Empire was mimesis, end quote. Philodemus, quote, who would claim that the writing of prose is not reliant on the Homeric poems, quote, or end quote. At stake here is the satisfaction of criterion 2 of mimesis criticism, analogy.
That is, analogous imitations. Were these texts targeted for imitation? And one need only talk about Virgil. So the Gospels and Acts are populated by analogs to Homeric characters and episodes that are so profuse, sequential, and unusual that they must not be ignored. At stake here is the satisfaction of criteria 3 to 5 of mimesis criticism: density, order, and distinctive traits.
And this is stuff we do with the antecedents to Scripture, even to Old Testament that come.
Absolutely, yeah.
The imitations of classical Greek literature also are interpretable. Criterion 6 in many ancient narratives, mimesis enabled, quote, constructing one's own self-representation through and against the canonical past. The literature of Roman Greece engages dynamically with inherited images, tropes, and identities, actively constructing a new way of looking at the world by imitating classical Greek poetry. The synoptic evangelists constructed their own new ways of looking at the world.
By resisting mimesis criticism is one of many methodologies needed to interpret the synoptic gospels. The disciplinary matrix we call New Testament scholarship has turned a blind eye to one of the most important and fascinating aspects of their composition. Here's an anecdote. I became very good friends at Harvard with one of the most famous of all Homeric scholars, Albert Lord, the author of The Singer of Tales. And we became very good friends, and he really inspired me to take more seriously Homer. But I was really trapped with one of his questions. He said, Dennis, why is it that your field, the study of early Christian texts, says nothing about the most important author of antiquity. And that was the spark that set the flame for me, because it was a glaring omission admitted by one of the great Homeric scholars of our time. And I think we really are blind to this to our own detriment, because these authors, by engaging the cultural capital of ancient Greeks, are replacing that mythology with what they understand to be a compassionate Jesus and his good news. And if you don't understand that, that's what the motivation is, you really are not understanding these texts.
There's so much. I hope that our friend, the smart fool, will take it, the constructive criticism, and of course, maybe backpedal a little and say, okay, maybe I didn't know. Maybe there is more to this. Maybe Dennis has some good points here, because what was brought up wasn't. It didn't take down anything. Every point you just said made plenty of sense, and I do think it's interesting that none of the parallels were engaged. But then again, if you already discredit based on your assumptions of this literature, then it's easy to dismiss. And again, goes back to your whole what has happened to you in marginalizing your work. And I'm glad to give you this platform. It makes me.
Thank you.
I love your work. I think that you're onto something. I mean, if you're wrong about something, you think maybe you might be wrong about some things, like whoop-de-doo. But there's some things that just are undeniably obvious to me.
Let's take the example now of the Testament of Abraham.
Okay, let me share my screen. I'm going to show everybody. I popped this up for everybody who was late in the stream yesterday to show them, but here we are.
This is why I chose this text. The Testament of Abraham is written in the same kind of register and grammatical imitation that you have in the Gospel of Mark. It's also written in the first century of the Common Era. It is written by a Jew, and we're going to see that he's imitating a passage that Mark imitated for the anointing of Jesus. And so let's go back and forth in our reading.
Okay.
So in Testament of Abraham 2-7, the Jewish author imitated Homer's account of Euryclea's recognition of Odysseus and Penelope's dream of the eagle.
Oh, and her pet geese, you say.
Oh, and pet geese, yeah.
Michael the archangel went to Abraham disguised as a young soldier and found the patriarch in his field. Abraham asked him, "Teach me your suppliant. Whence do you come, and from what kind of army?" Michael's answer was sufficiently elusive to keep Abraham in the dark. He doesn't want him to know. The two men then set out for a trip, but Michael refused to travel by horse, which set the scene for an obligatory foot washing.
On their way, they encountered a cypress tree that spoke as an oracle. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God, who calls to those who love him. In Odyssey 19, Odysseus referred to the prophetic oak tree at Dodona, which would say when he would return. In the Gospel of Mark, by the way, he says, if you want to know the future, go consult the fig tree. Now we have these comparative text box, and you know how to do this. I'll read the left-hand side, and you can read the right.
I'm with you.
And I hope that your viewers can see the similar wording in Greek. Odysseus, disguised as a beggar, sat across from Penelope for the first time in 20 years.
Michael is disguised as a soldier.
Penelope says, "Stranger, I myself will ask you first, whence is your lineage? Where are your parents, city and parents?"
Abraham, teach me your suppliant. Whence do you come, and from what kind of army?
Odysseus dissimulates because he doesn't want to reveal his identity.
Michael obfuscates because he doesn't want to reveal his identity.
Okay,
When they approached the house, they sat in the courtyard.
Penelope, I have an old woman with a wise heart in her breast. She will wash your feet, though she is frail. Wise Eurycleia, arise now and come. Bathe this man who resembles your king.
Abraham said to Isaac, his son, my child Isaac, draw water from the well, bring it to me in a bowl so that we may wash the feet of this stranger, for he is weary, having come to us on a long journey. And Isaac, after running to the well, drew water into the bowl and brought it to them.
Yeah, and you can see that the Greek is the same words. So, the author is really advertising his imitation. So Eurycleia agreed, I will wash your feet, but Eurycleia took the bowl and poured into it lots of water.
And Abraham approached and washed the feet of the archstrategos, Michael. Yeah. The guts of Abraham were moved.
Eurycleia weeps. She casts down tears, and Penelope weeps. So sorry for the Greek.
And he wept for the stranger, and on seeing his father weeping, Isaac too wept.
When Eurycleia recognized Odysseus' scar, she dropped his leg. It fell into the bowl and spilled the water.
Oh, you got down low too, down below. Was known as...
Oh, yeah, and was known as the niptra, the washing.
When the archstrategos saw them weeping, he wept with them, and the tears of the archstrategos fell into the water for washing, and they became precious stones.
When she recognized the scar, simultaneously joy and anguish overwhelmed her heart. Both of her eyes filled with tears.
When Abraham saw the marvel, he was stunned.
She then promised Odysseus that she would keep the news of his return to herself and tell no one.
Took the stone secretly and hid the secret, keeping it only in his heart.
Why don't you read the next? Abraham then.
Okay. Abraham then ordered Isaac to prepare a bedroom with linens and a table with wonderful food for the enjoyment of the guests, whose appearance surpasses all human beings. Penelope had given her female slaves the same instructions. When Odysseus refused such hospitality, she said that no stranger ever had come to her home who was as wise. After eating, Abraham, Isaac, and the angelic stranger went to bed. God sent the mention of death into the heart of Isaac as in dreams. Then Isaac, weeping, woke, his father hoping for a final embrace before his death. Michael explained that Isaac had seen a terrifying dream and came to us weeping. And when we saw this, we were too moved and wept. The narrator will say more about the dream later.
Yes, and the reason that this is, and you can see this this crossbar. I omitted the dream that Penelope has when her husband will return. So I'll read the last paragraph. I think we've
okay. So down here.
This. I'll read it. Surely it is not by accident that Odyssey 19 and Testament of Abraham 2-7 both narrate recognitions by hosts that wash the feet of disguised strangers, and followed by dreams with symbolism requiring allegorical interpretations. Both dreams involve descending and ascending characters. The eagle represents Odysseus. The luminous man in the Testament represents Michael. And predictions of impending death, the suitors or Abraham's. Now, there is no way to account for those parallels without saying that the author has this episode in mind. And it's the same one that Mark uses at about the same time with the same literary register. Now, I'm sure that scholars are, my critics are going to say, oh yeah, that's going on in the Testament of Abraham, but it's not going on in the Gospel of Mark, because the Gospel of Mark is protected by theology. in a way for Christians that this text is not.
I do. I think it's important. I brought this up yesterday, but you're here with me, Dennis. Before we go to Q&A, and we're about to do that, I think it's really a good thing to bring up Eurycleia, if that's okay with you, and show them, of course, the book. Just to tease people for a second here, you should get the book if you can afford it. It's $27, and you've put your heart and soul into this book. Mark's Anointing Woman and Homer's Eurycleia. Did you want me to read?
Sure. Go ahead.
The woman who anoints Jesus for his burial in Mark surely imitates the famous Homeric niptra, or washing, by Eurycleia, Odysseus' nurse, who recognized the scar on his thigh while washing his feet. Here are the most relevant lines where Penelope speaks to Eurycleia about the renown that comes to those who show hospitality. Quote, "If one is noble and of noble heart, strangers carry one's fame far and wide to all peoples, and many speak of one's excellence." Then prudent Penelope said to him, the beggar, "Again, dear stranger, never before has a man so prudent of dear strangers from afar come here to my house, so thoughtfully prudent as you are in everything that you say. I have an old woman with a wise heart in her breast, who nursed well and cherished that unlucky man. Wise Eurycleia, arise now and come, bathe this man who is the same age as your lord." And the old woman took the gleaming basin to wash his feet and poured into it lots of cold water, and then drew the hot. But Odysseus sat at the fireplace. So she approached and began to wash her lord. Immediately she recognized the scar that a boar long ago had gouged with a white tusk. After touching Odysseus's beard, she said, "You most surely are Odysseus, dear child. I did not recognize you before, not until I touched the whole body of my lord." Later, she anointed him richly with oil. Melantho, sister to Melanthius, daughter of Dolios, deceitful, had complained about Penelope's generosity to the foreign beggar. Odysseus then rebuked her for discrimination against the poor, and Penelope accused her of having committed a monstrous act of inhospitality. Here's an image from 440 BC of Eurycleia washing Odysseus' feet as a poor beggar disguised. As Mark's Jesus was eating, a woman carrying... Do you want me to continue?
No, I think that's enough, probably.
Okay, because I know you go down and you get into the boxes and stuff, and we can show parallels. But what you're suggesting is it's happening in Mark, it's happening in the Testament of Abraham, which is contemporaneous, approximately, by a Jewish author, same register type of Greek, and he's playing with Homer.
Yeah, and also in the Markan account, that it is said that what she has done will be known far and wide, wherever the gospel is preached. The name Eurycleia means renowned far and wide. So the author wants you to see these parallels. He wants you to see that Jesus is recognized by this woman, and it's to her credit because she understands what the disciples don't, that is, that Jesus must suffer.